We're now moving on to the session which is looking at regulation and the role of Ofcom, and in particular the approach Ofcom's taking, which can either encourage or potentially inhibit investment by the independent operators. One of the things that we've been doing with Ofcom is arguing that they should be paying more attention to the work of the Altnets, not just in urban areas, but also in rural areas, particularly areas which Ofcom is concerned about competition. And we commissioned Point Topic to do an update of the report they do for each year, looking at specifically at investment in the independent sector, which came to the conclusion that about £1.76 billion worth of investment has been announced since the beginning of 2019, just in the independent sector. So that's aside from investment going through from BT Group through Openreach and Virgin Media. It's quite a significant amount of money, and a lot of that money is going into investing in networks in rural areas. So that's one of the big issues we've been pushing with Ofcom. They need to take more account of that. This session is chaired by Gita Sorensen. Gita, I think, is known to many of us as one of the foremost regulatory experts in the sector. She's forgotten more about what Ofcom does and thinks than I'll ever hope to know. So Gita's going to chair the session. I'd like to welcome Gita onto the stage, and Gita can then introduce the rest of the panel members. Let's just see if we've got a problem.
Hi, Malcolm. Gita's just coming. I think she just refreshed the page, so she should be appearing in a couple of seconds.
Thanks very much, Lucy. That's great. Whilst Gita's coming onto the stage, let's introduce the rest of the panel members as well and bring them on. So, here's Gita now. Gita, hi. Great.
Hi, Malcolm. So, perfect timing to drop off the network, but I'm back on. Hello, everybody. Good morning. As Malcolm says, I'm Gita Sorensen. I run GOS Consulting. I'm here to look after kind of chairing the session on regulation and investment. And I'd like to invite our panelists up to the podium now. Paul Jacobus from Ofcom. I've got David Cullen from ITS Technology Group, Alex Blowers from CityFibre, Robert Skinner from Octopus Investment, and David Stranack from Community Fibre. The format we've chosen for this panel is that each panelist will do a brief introduction of themselves and of what they think are key issues that will be worth discussing on this panel. We all have views, opinions, and experience to share, but based on the experience of what's coming up in the Q&A, I think we're going to be kept quite busy as well with very good and interesting questions. So if we can start by asking Paul Jacobus to introduce himself and do a brief intro to his views on the issues.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Jacobus. I am the Director of DPA implementation or peer implementation at Ofcom. Many of you will probably know me because between 2016 and 2018, I was part of the team who relaunched and developed the peer regulations, which we are currently relying on. I then disappeared off for a couple of years to work on a different project, and have now come back in to help to move forward again on peer and DPA implementation. As you probably know, Ofcom is actively seeking engagement with all fibre builders. We always have plenty of conversations with Openreach because we regulate them in so many different aspects, but we are very keen to have lots of conversations with some of the altnets, and we already have managed to go out and do a field visit in the last couple of weeks to see CityFibre in the field and the way that they're deploying. And I'll say up front that if you guys would like to host either myself or some of my colleagues for a visit to see how you're facing up with the challenges of deploying fibre in your particular area, just reach out to me through my email or later through the chat rooms, and we'd be more than happy to engage with you. And I think that sets the way which we're trying to approach fibre and fibre build. What we really understand is that fibre build is not a simple thing. It's a complex set of interrelated processes which have to move forward and get working together. We think that we've managed to get some very good progress in the way that regulation has helped that work over the last couple of years. People now say that PIA is functional, although it still could do with quite a lot of improvement, especially when it comes to scale use. And that's something which we're now starting to focus on quite strongly. We're also thinking about how you can use PIA, for example, underground lead-ins or overhead poles to connect to customers, and how the lead to cash process can be made to be more efficient and effective. And that's another area which we're thinking about quite strongly. And we're thinking about that in a large opportunity. We see that in some ways COVID-19 has offered an opportunity for penetration to actually make a step change going forward, because in essence what's happened is a lot of people at home have suddenly discovered what latency, contention and network resiliency actually means in the real world, and have suddenly realized that actually they could do with something better than what they have at the moment. It might be good enough to watch Netflix, but it might not be good enough to do what we're doing here today. And I think that was a topic which was touched on in previous things. So we can see that things like lead to cash and how you connect customers and how you actually move forward becomes increasingly important, and there is an opportunity going forward there. And Ofcom is looking forward to engage with industry and thinking about that happens. So thank you very much, Gita.
Thanks, Paul. Can I ask David to pick up?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gita. Good morning, everybody. My name is David Cullen, for those who don't know me, Director of Regulation and Policy for ITS Technology Group, who kind of consider ourselves to be one of the kind of leading wave 2 Altnet providers working across both urban and rural. As founder director of Prism Business Consulting, we're also very involved in developing the NIC study on the costs of telecommunications rollout to move to a Fibre UK. So, you know, the subject of how the regulation moves and how the investment moves is very, very dear to my heart for both of those. I think the key issue for me now, which I think we should explore in this panel, is I think as Gita, you mentioned right up at the headline, that Altnets have a really valuable role to play. We've been doing it for a significant period of time, both across urban and rural. And we are absolutely passionate about delivering across all market types: consumer, residential, business, urban and rural. And you know, and really have proved have a role to play in delivering quality services. Now, if we look at the scores that come out on Trustpilot, on ratings, everything else, yeah, we're delivering good networks. The challenge, I think, is how we do that in conjunction with with subsidies going in the right way to accelerate rollout to the targets we want to help achieve. For me, I think that comes down to two elements which are quite critical. One is an apparent disjoint as we see it. I know it's not necessarily deliberate, but it's just not quite a joining of dots between the new regulation of areas 1, 2 and 3 from Ofcom's WFTMR, along with BTMS's F20 outside-in program. And I think there's a disjoint there between, in simple terms, what we really define as practitioners in the market and what we see as practitioners in the market as what are genuine digitally deprived areas, e.g. a business park in the middle of area 1 or even an area 2 Ofcom defined regulatory space could easily still be as digitally deprived as something in F20, but it's not going to get subsidies to help that under the way we're beginning to move. I think a joining of the dots there is going to be really quite important. I think the second element is actually what we can do together, you know, and this is a big collaborative question and plea, to really break through the wholesale challenge which we have. Because in order to make an effective set of fibre infrastructure for the UK, we have to really be able to genuinely deliver a very efficient and effective wholesale market across new networks, as well as the principal, you know, networks from Openreach and maybe Virgin, Liberty Global in the future. I think that's really important. It's clearly a good thing for Ofcom to say within the, within WFTMR around Area 3. I don't think anybody challenges that it should, that if a new infrastructure is going in, we should look at a wholesale platform over that. What we need to do is find a way, and maybe through gaining provider-led switching and the delivery of a wholesale aggregation platform, for example, we can get there. But the needs to drive to a means of genuinely being able to bring major ISPs as well as smaller ISPs onto a common set of infrastructure through a wholesale platform is really key. And just to close off on that, that's one of the reasons why ITS, along with 3 other INCA partner members, are now in collaboration to start trying to drive that initiative forwards by exploring the development of a wholesale aggregation platform. So that's ITS, county broadband, airband, and white fibre. But I think the more we begin to get those triggers happening and find out how we can work with Ofcom and with DCMS to really stimulate that and get genuine dialogue going between the ISP layer and the network layer would be really valuable.
Thanks, David. Alex?
Morning, everyone. So I suppose, sorry, for those of you who don't know me, Alex Blowers, Director of Regulatory Affairs at CityFibre. I suppose where I am at the moment is, compared with previous appearances at previous INCA conferences, probably in a much more optimistic frame of mind, and actually, I think pretty pleased overall with the direction of travel that Ofcom has set out in the WFTMR. I would give that document at least a 7 out of 10, and possibly even edging up to an 8, and I'm a reasonably strict marker, so Paul, you can take some comfort from that. I think there are 2 or 3 remaining outstanding issues, some of which David, I think, has already flagged, and Malcolm also in his introductory remarks. So I'm still concerned about the kind of risk of a significant regulatory error around the boundary definition of geographies. So the famous Area 2, Area 3 boundary issue is one that continues to concern me, partly because right now I don't know exactly where CityFibre will want to build networks in the next 5 years. And I worry that any boundary which arbitrarily tries to determine what's contestable and what isn't contestable at this stage is likely to result in significant regulatory error. So I think that's an issue that's worth kind of circling back around on. And I'm also still concerned to get the best possible regulatory playing field between my company and also other altnets in the sector and Openreach. And I think Ofcom's given quite a lot of comfort around the steps that it will take to protect us from anti-competitive practices. I think Paul and the team that he leads have done actually a very good job in starting to drive real improvements now in the PIA products. But there are still some issues that I think are blind spots for Ofcom, which I think should be addressed. So I think one of those is I worry that the headlong rush to create the right conditions for Openreach to switch off its copper network, not enough consideration is being given in that process to how you can protect the interests of the competitive market. And I also worry that we're still operating with a slight, echoing something David said really, there's a slight disconnect between what we're doing in the regulatory space and what the government is seeking to execute in terms of its 2025 plan. There's a big part of that for me, which is about transparency of build, and in particular, some kind of established baseline for who is going to build what where, because there's no question in my mind that the only way that the 2025 target will be achievable is if there is some degree of efficient build, and by that I mean minimizing the extent of overbuild, particularly in rural, between now and 2025. And I think Ofcom has some tools to allow us to make some progress in that direction, but I'd like to see those tools put to use pretty damn quick.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank
you. I'll move on to Rob.
Hi, so Rob Skinner from Octopus Investments. So we're a relatively new investor in the space, moving into in the last couple of years. We're currently backing Jurassic Fibre and Swish Fibre. to be honest, all the main points on my agenda are the ones already covered. It's area 2, area 3, where that boundary lies. As Alex says, actually, we've been pleased with the WFTMR in a similar mindset. I think it's a well thought through document, but one of the key issues that we're seeing right now is what we think could be unintentional, but is creating concerns for people who are actually looking to invest around where that boundary could be. So anywhere from kind of the 10% to 40% probably of the UK from lowest to hardest to build. We believe that the current wording of WFTMR does incentivize Openreach to overbuild where other people aren't. Effectively gives some kind of subsidy to them. It doesn't create the fair playing field that Alex was talking about. I think every operator here, we've moved into this sector because we like fair competition. Is what gets us up in the morning. There's a land grab going on. Actually, we're really excited about that. There's 15% fibre in the UK. How do we get to 100%? Well, I think every one of us is going to be straining every sinew, as Matt Warman mentioned, to try and get us there. But look, we don't want. There isn't need for unnecessary overbuild. We're keen to try and avoid situations where maybe the incumbent is accidentally encouraged to do that. There's enough for everyone to be aiming for here. So when we're looking, if I look back over especially the last year or so in investment committee decisions that we've had, the focus has been, yes, of course, we're talking about the company's operations that we're looking at, but actually there's a huge amount of conversation goes into WFTMR, the regulator, DCMS. Why isn't there alignment between DCMS's 20% and Ofcom's bottom 30%? It's frustrating for investors. And I think whilst, yes, it's a very attractive sector at the moment, there's lots of big checks and competitive processes being written, big checks being written by infrastructure investors to come into the sector, actual pounds into the ground in locations where people really need it. The capex being spent, people are being a bit hesitant because they don't quite know exactly how Openreach are going to be encouraged or discouraged from building. So.
Thanks, Bob, and we'll finish with Tim.
Thanks, Gita. And just touching on...
Tim, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. So just touching on some of the PIA comments that have already been made. I think CityFibre or Openreach told us we're now one of the largest users of PIA, and I think our thanks need to go to Paul and his team, and indeed Catherine and her team at Openreach. It is. I think Alex said, is a much easier product to use now than perhaps it was a few years ago. There's still work to do, though. I think the whole question around equivalence still needs to be looked at again. It wasn't Ofcom's argument for not applying equivalence last time was not that strong, and perhaps it's something we just need to look at again. A couple of other points, though, that I think it's worth raising just from a broader regulatory point that I don't think have been mentioned so far is a paper came out last week, was it the week before, on the implementation of the European Electronic Communications Code. That is going to have a massive impact on a lot of our operating models. Fortunately, Ofcom have, in their wisdom, given us some extra time to implement some of those, and particularly some of the more complex things such as switching. But don't think that that's 2 years away, so we don't need to think about it. There is an awful lot of work to do on that. So I think that's one thing as an industry we need to be thinking about, how we are going to implement those changes to the general conditions. And my hobby horse, as many of you will always know, being an urban builder, is around wayleaves and how we can resolve that issue around wayleaves. I think Connell in the opening session mentioned about operators talking French and landlords talking German. I think that is a key issue. We don't necessarily understand each other. I know DCMS have been doing a little bit of work to try to speak to landlords and speak to operators and try to convene some dialogue there. I would like to think I'm bilingual, having done a number of years at Westminster City Council, and so can speak, I hope, both French and German, to use his analogy. But there is still a lot of work. I think the industry doesn't fully appreciate that if we want to roll fibre out to every home in the UK, that means we have to engage with every landlord in the UK to get their permission to install fibre on their property. And there are a lot of landlords out there who don't understand that yet. And so what can we do to actually inform them, help them, educate them that we really need to start getting fibre onto their building? And this Graham mentioned earlier, this is a particular problem in London. We are simply not going to hit the 2025 target in London if some of the big London landlords don't sign waileys relatively soon.
Thanks, Tim. So I think one of the themes that we have now heard a couple of times is the enabling factor of PIA. And I mean, personally, I've also been very deeply involved in the development of the new PIA product and working with Ofcom and operators to improve it. And I think one of the points Tim just made, Paul, was what is Ofcom's ongoing view on equivalence, and is it something we should be holding our breath for the outcome of the WFTMR, or is Ofcom's proposals in the WFTMR as basically more of the same, what we should be expecting?
So, Gita, you know that's a impossible question to answer because we're in consultation. So we've published our proposals on where we are. There is an intention to have a statement out in early 2021. So what I can talk about is what is there at the moment. I think we have to remind ourselves that there is a requirement on Openreach to provide equivalence for peer, such that users of peer are not at a cost, time or complexity disadvantage. And we're endeavouring to make sure that that SMP condition, which is in place now, is met and fulfilled and followed through, which is where we're working very hard with both the Altnets and with Openreach to look at that in quite a lot of detail. What we have to recognise is that we've essentially gone from a cottage industry to 91 accredited peer users in the space of 2 years, with tens of thousands of poles and kilometres of duct now reserved and many thousands actually in use. And so the industry has changed, and now we are thinking in what does that equivalence mean and how does that go forward from there. It's why we keep on saying we're happy to talk to industry on this sort of stuff so we get a better understanding. You know, the critical point for us in Ofcom is, unlike a lot of the regulation which we do, peer isn't a silver bullet type regulation. It's a very detailed, lots of small incremental steps, all which have to work together in concert for the whole thing to work together. And it's something which in general a regulator like Ofcom is less familiar with. We're used to, well, here's the price for the product and now it's a single intervention. We recognise that this is a very different one with a lot more complexity. But to reassure you, equivalence is already there in place in terms of no cost, time, or complexity disadvantage. And if you think that there are problems, you come and talk to me and we'll try and work out what's going on.
Thanks, Paul. No, I know that was a slightly trick question, but it was more a matter of time of focus, I think. Alex, you were introducing this thing right at the end of your subject, at the end of your introduction on the decommissioning of BT's fibre. What's your concern in that area?
Well, I think it's first of all, there's an unavoidable. So for a firm like CityFibre, which is essentially in the wholesale only operator, essentially in the market of selling connectivity to the ISPs, I think there's no getting around the fact that allowing Openreach to drive its ISP customers off copper and onto fibre, and effectively force migrate customers off copper onto fibre changes the competitive dynamic quite substantially. I think it's very hard to argue with the fundamental proposition, which is we should be encouraging people off copper and onto fibre. So there's a balancing act clearly to be struck there. I think the most recent consultation has surprised me, and I think has surprised many across the industry, by the accelerated timescale for allowing not only the stop sale copper services, but actually Openreach to get on the path now to actually switching off copper networks, which will inevitably mean force migrating significant numbers of customers off the copper. And that brings into sharp focus two concerns that we've had for some time. The first is there's a kind of reputational problem for the whole industry if some customers have a particularly bad experience through that forced migration. So, I think there's a general view across the industry that this has to be approached with extraordinary care to ensure that there are no unintended consequences of forced migration, no loss of particular service capabilities that exist on the copper, for instance, and no customer groups that are left behind. But I also think, particularly in those circumstances, which I think there will be many, where actually that copper switch off is taking place in a location where our fibre and Openreach's fibre are competing head to head, I think any kind of quasi-public information campaign around that has to absolutely make clear that the Openreach fibre is not the only fibre in town. I think there's plenty of precedents for this in regulatory processes in the past of making sure that at these kind of technology inflection points, if you want to promote competition, you have to intervene to make sure that the full panoply of choice available to customers is actually communicated, and that the comms are not somehow leading to a remonopolization of the market. So those are key. We've been flagging them for some time. We don't see those particularly reflected in Ofcom's consultation, and that's a concern to us. And my guess is it will be a concern for other people in the sort of broader INCA community as well.
Does this resonate with you, David and Tim?
Yes, very definitely. I mean, I think as Alex is saying, the bottom line is we're all aiming to get everybody off copper onto fibre as fast as possible. Obviously, the competitive dynamic will absolutely change. I think that, however, if we don't think about it carefully, and again, it comes back to straight weight of an incumbent in the market. I think if there was, exactly as you're saying, Alex, I think if there is a platform, it comes back to my point about wholesale and sharing and access to both a commonality of networks as well as a common access at the ISP level, it levels the entire market. I'm not saying that's easy to do, and I'm not for a second suggesting I've got a golden bullet to achieve it, but I think we've got to be looking at that bi-directional flow of ISPs using whatever fibre's there on whatever infrastructure is in, at the same time as network providers are able to offer that service to whatever ISP is available up there. And I think, as I said, that's the utopian position. How we get there, don't know. But I think if we don't address that bi-directional flow pretty quickly, we're going to find ourselves in some pretty embarrassing cul-de-sacs.
I also think from an industry and regulator point of view, there is a big risk that we will end up with a lot of consumer confusion. And just picking up on one of the points made in the question and answer, when you tell somebody who thinks they've got a fibre connection, actually they've got to turn that off and move to a fibre connection, they're going to get very confused. And that is something as an industry that we really need to be addressing and making clear to consumers what really is fibre and what isn't really fibre. And I know that's something that the Advertising Standards Agency has ducked a number of times, regulators ducked a number of times, but it really is an issue that if we're going to avoid confusing consumers, we really need to address before this switch off takes place.
Now, one of the things that I know that some CPs have argued in the WFTMR in the context of the copper retirement is in relation to the stop sell, i.e. that at the moment the Ofcom proposal in WFTMR is a stop sell happens when BT has 75% market share, or sorry, availability of fibre in an exchange area. And quite a few CPs were proposing that that should be made possible when there is fibre to 75% of the premises in that exchange area, not necessarily Openreach fibre. Now, we know that you can't force Openreach to stop sell, but it should be made available to do so. even alongside some of the other issues we've just heard now, Paul, are these concerns that we didn't see them kind of highlighted in the recent consultation, nor did we see them highlighted very much in the WFTMR in terms of the competitive impact. We see a lot of discussion of the competitive impact of downstream competitors who are using the Openreach platform, but very, very little. The only thing I remember in both of those consultations about infrastructure competition is about preventing Openreach from doing kind of a very small level of coverage in one area in order to deter investment in that area and then moving on. Other than that, I mean, do you have anything you could share with us in terms of your thinking on that?
So you once again, you've asked me the question which I can't give the answer to, because
I'm not going to answer any consultation, but your analysis, the underlying reasons.
So the consultation contains the reasoning and the proposals which we've got in there, and we know that many of you guys have responded to that, which we are now considering and thinking about how we get back to on that one. There's an interesting point which is coming up, which is about the wholesaling. And getting together and thinking about that, and it was something which I made in my earlier in the introductory point, which is, I think Alex, you used the phrase, it's a point of inflection in the market at the moment, and it seems to be that we are reaching that point of inflection in the market. Before I came to work at Ofcom, I worked in industry for an ISP, and before that I worked in the mobile industry, and I see echoes of the inflection point when prepaid was being launched in the late 1990s, where it became a sort of land grab, where the networks realized that get the customer onto your network and then later work out what you'll do with them. Was the ethos which hit essentially Christmas of 1999 was when I was doing that, and I think it's something which I can see being reflected coming here. The homes which you're going past already, if you can get those customers on board and get them connected, then I suspect the competitive threat from copper switch off becomes less of a problem, because they're not being switched off from Openreach copper because they've already migrated onto something which is better. In terms of then thinking about the wholesale and ISPs getting together to think about the wholesale package and this sort of stuff, that's quite a difficult one to achieve, because if you're a large ISP, you want to make sure that you have consistency of quality of standards and contracts across multiple different vendors, which is sometimes quite hard for them to agree with and think about. And if you look at the mobile market and the world of MVNOs, you then saw a layer of MVNEs starting to come through, and try and provide service to the smaller providers who wanted to go onto the bigger networks. So it was a mirror image, but there's a similar sort of thing which helped to facilitate some of that to happening. And I speculate whether that will start to emerge in this market to allow the larger ISPs to be able to platform onto multiple smaller fibre providers. Just a thought and an observation, but I think the key challenge now is to get that lead to cash and get the penetration figures up, so that questions of copper switch off in 2 or 3 years time become less acute or less worrying, would be my consideration.
Thanks, Paul. I know Alex just asked for a word, but I just wanted if Rob had any comments on this conversation before we move on to Alex.
I think the main thing is just, again, is avoiding a misstep. It's making sure that there isn't some bizarre incentive for Openreach to overbuild everyone, otherwise they don't get to copper switch off everyone. Just avoiding those situations to me is really important. I think wholesale is a debate that we've been having as INCA for quite some time, and I think it will become more and more important over this regulatory period. But for me, the key is getting the fibre in the ground. Look, we're 15%. Yes, we all need to be thinking about wholesale and stuff like that for when we need to, so it doesn't come to us as a surprise as maybe kind of New Year 2020, New Year 2000 was, as Paul mentioned. But really, how are we all going to effectively get the fibre in the ground and get it from 15% to 100%? I think that's the main focus.
Alex?
Thanks, Gita. Just coming off mute. So I'm conscious we want to move on to other topics, but I think Rob's, so Paul is clearly right and Rob's clearly right that the focus here in the first instance has to be kind of voluntary migration. How can we accelerate the rate of voluntary migration onto fibre from copper? I'd be less concerned about the forced migration issue if I saw lots of effort and energy going into fixing the switching stuff, which Tim's already referred to, and also the kind of consumer misinformation problem, which we're all deeply aware of and which Tim has already eloquently set out. The only other thing I want to mention is the elephant in the corner on this issue ultimately will be if we actually end up with a government outside-in programme where significant chunks of that are going to non-Openreach alternative fibre providers. Where does that leave us in terms of an eventual copper switchover? Because I think it would be pretty remarkable if the government was subsidising a non-Openreach full fibre network in rural, if actually then there wasn't some thought process that led to the idea that eventually the copper should be switched off in that area and all of the existing customers on the copper should be migrated onto the full fibre. And that, I think, unavoidably raises the question of, does there need to be a mechanism that encourages BT and Openreach to make that kind of decision, which at the moment, I'm not sure they're quite at the point of having thought through the implications.
Thanks. That actually quite neatly leads us into the kind of coexistence of the final 20 outside in and Ofcom's intervention for Area 3. I'm aware that a lot of Altnets have tried very hard to understand how that came about, and I'm particularly referring here to Ofcom's Area 3 definition. And there's been changes, obviously. Initially, there was a significant difference between how Areas 2 and Area 3 were going to be regulated. Subsequently, there's been an agreement by Openreach to undertake a voluntary commitment to a level of coverage in Area 3, which has led to consistent price regulation in Areas 2 and 3. The main difference, therefore, only being that Area 3 is where Openreach is making its commitment. I think it's widely understood that the level of commitment Openreach has made of 3.2 million is, I think it's best described as generous in the context of how of balancing the books for Ofcom in terms of the cost of the change to the price regulation versus the actual commitment expected from Openreach and the value of that over the period of time, and it's raised some concerns because it certainly amongst a lot of the Altnets I'm talking to is being seen as an opportunity that is being actively used by Openreach to well, as I eloquently put it once, stick their fingers in all the sandwiches they want and then leaving everybody else to eat the ones that Openreach doesn't like, i.e. to effectively serve the areas that they probably would cover anyway because they are commercially attractive areas that are in the 3.2 commitment. I just wondered, how does that affect us now that we have a smaller difference between Areas 2 and 3 in terms of regulatory intervention? Alex, how does that affect CityFibre's willingness and worries about investing in what's now Area 3?
Well, I think from our perspective, the kind of diminishing gap between the regulatory approach, as you've set it out, Gita, is actually pretty helpful. But I think, you know, and I'm sure Rob will have views on this. I still think I have a kind of instinctive discomfort about the way that the declaration of the 3.2 million seems to have basically hoovered up most of what, to my mind, in Area 3 was already questionable about whether it should be in Area 2. So I still think there's, particularly because of this interaction with the way that the outside-in programme will work, I worry that the effect of that is still going to be in some way to sterilise a part of the market where actually Altnets, CityFibre included, actually might have been, you know, just as willing to make a big commitment to extend out into those areas. But I'm sure Rob has a you know, a kind of developed view on all of that as well.
Over to you, Rob, I think.
Yeah, look, I think that DCMS are clear that they're focusing their efforts on the bottom 20% of the UK. They think 10% of the UK you would like really need subsidies. 10 to 20% may need subsidy, but eventually there'll be competition if we left it to it. But let's try and accelerate it. Just to simplify my take on what they're saying. I mean, in the DCMS Select Committee last week or the week before, Matt Warman highlighted there should be consistency between DCMS and Ofcom. There shouldn't really be a debate about if an area is competitive or not. We can all create models. People like ourselves and other investors are moving in and building networks in places which are currently in Area 3. Now, we wouldn't do that if it wasn't economically viable. Likewise, Openreach has already built 600k off the 3.2 million properties in Area 3 that's just announced. It wouldn't do that if it was economically viable. So, as Paul mentioned earlier, like the last 2 years has created quite a big shift in the industry, and the Altnet community has made a lot of difference. And we're simply asking Ofcom to take note of that, as effectively they said they would at the start of the consultation, definitely at the start of this year, and look at the plans, quite credible plans, backed by more money than Openreach has right now to build in the UK. There's lots of money now backing Altnets who can build cheaper in some circumstances and can build better quality networks, work well with local communities because they're physically in location rather than a large incumbent building across the whole of the UK. We don't believe that there should be really any areas in that outside the F20 that Openreach necessarily has an advantage above an Altnet. That is thanks to PIA. That's really allowed the marginal investments by other network operators to be the same, if not be a bit more nimble. So that's great, and now we're just trying to effectively take advantage of that and build networks as quick as possible. What we're now faced with, though, is that Openreach put out an announcement, then pulled it down a minute later about the locations that they're looking to build in Area 3. Lo and behold, lots of those are locations that the rest of us are also building. By definition, they're competitive. So we don't quite understand why Ofcom is encouraging. Yes, it's good to encourage competition, and therefore it's good to encourage Openreach to build, but don't encourage Openreach to build in such a way that dissuades others, or indeed encourages Openreach to build over the top of where others have already built. That's our main frustration. Overbuild doesn't help anyone apart from the incumbent who may benefit from other parties, their economics not being as attractive as they otherwise would have been.
Thanks, Bob. I think that was a very good point to finish this session on, and Malcolm has popped up as this kind of, you are out of time. Thanks very much, everybody, for a very good conversations. We could have gone on another couple of hours, I'm sure. Thanks for your contributions.
Thank you, Gita, and thanks to everybody on the panel. And as usual at INCA conferences, some of the big, hairy questions have been asked or put, not least, if an Altnet's building fibre networks in particular areas, whether subsidised or not, at what point does Openreach start thinking, well, and BT, we need to deliver over those networks? I think Catherine sort of alluded to some thinking around that a little bit earlier on, and so on. And thanks very much to Paul for very graciously saying, you know, he can't answer all of Gita's questions, and thanks, Gita, for posing those challenging questions, and everybody else. So we'll take a couple of minutes. Gita's.
And one thing, Malcolm, before we go is, I have not ignored the question. Everybody says, when will Ofcom redefine fibre as part fibre and full fibre? It's just that it's not really Ofcom's role to do so, and I that's why I didn't put that forward, and I thought that would be even more unfair, and Paul, and you know, it's not full hunting season yet.
Tim made the point really well, though. I mean, this is a huge issue,
Yeah,
and we really need to get to grips with this. We've got to find a way around this one.
Yeah.
Lots of discussion on wholesale coming up this afternoon. Lloyd will be chairing the panel session on wholesale. Lloyd Filton from County Broadband, who's leading the group of 4 who are working hard to look at the development of wholesale platforms supported by INCA and others as well. So we're going to move on. We're going to take a short couple of minutes break whilst Lucy, our conference goddess, who's in charge of everything, totally omnipotent is Lucy. She'll assemble the next panel session, which is tackling the skills challenge. So look forward to speaking in a few minutes. Thank you very much.